What if a president blew the whistle on corruption within his government? How shocking can that be?
Sencilla. Y es porque le quiero pedir en público de que investiguemos a todos los que están acá. Para atrás y para adelante.
In this video, we talk about the viral video that sent chills. President Nayib Bukele announcing a surprise corruption investigation into his own cabinet. We will examine responses, what's next from Bukele's administration, and what it might mean for a country fighting against deadly cartels. Surprise corruption investigation on Bukele's cabinet. This viral video clip opens dramatically with President Nayib Bukele standing at the camera, left behind a long conference table and surrounded by his cabinet members. The scene takes place at the presidential palace in San Salvador. What translates typically to the clout and status afforded by this administration is portrayed through the camera being locked on Bukele in a medium close-up, showing only his serious and stoic face. As he opens his term, he speaks inaudibly yet firmly on the value of integrity and transparency. As Bukele approaches the pivotal moment in his speech, he hesitates. He formally asks the Attorney General present, not a member of his executive branch, to retroactively and currently investigate every cabinet member for corruption so that no one is above the law. The camera then turns to the Attorney General, who nods gravely, realizing the weight of the request. Speaking further, Bukele specifies that full and clear investigations should be conducted. As Bukele speaks, every cabinet member's reaction is captured. Some sit there in stunned, deathly silence, with eyes open wide in shock. Others make nervous glances at each other, unease more than palpable. Others keep poker faces, trying to cloak their concern or disbelief. The mix of shock, anxiety, and apprehension underlines how totally out of the blue Bukele's decree was. The video tone is somber, driven home through the light yet stern colors and the quiet and formal setting of the conference room. His words are heavy in this atmosphere, wherein each sentence turns into a promise of accountability, with huge potential for political fallout. The seriousness is further underscored by Bukele's measured speech and expression that in no way could speak for itself to portray anything other than his commitment to allegations of corruption, even within his own ranks. The video provoked an instant and varied reaction from the public, which flowed like a flop on social media. Millions of views were obtained on Twitter, and thousands of comments were made within a few hours. The very audacious move earned appreciation from Bukele's supporters as a necessary step towards clarity and justice. Common reflections from the fans applauded this move by Bukele with the rest of their heart and showed relief and hope for real change in the government. El Salvador has faced economic and political problems for many years. For years, it has been glued together by gang violence, corruption, and financial instability in El Salvador. Criminal groups like MS-13 and Barrio 18 have dominated neighborhoods for years. They extort businesses threatened with mafia terror, who will not yield to submission. It was so bad that El Salvador became one of the deadliest countries on earth, with rates rising to historic figures: homicide. Then came Nayib Bukele, a charismatic young leader who stormed to victory on the promise of change. Bukele surfed into the presidency on an anti-corruption message almost as much as one of gangster warfare. He took the unconventional, which must also be admitted as a bold step that was very well received among the public, who were all willing to believe in peace and stability. Within months, strict measures that Nayib Bukele's administration had taken to attack gang violence proved to be very effective in lowering homicides. They were conducted in the form of mass detentions, militarization in large sectors controlled by criminal armed groups, and a new mega prison where hundreds of gang members would be incarcerated. In March 2022, El Salvador's government launched one of the most aggressive security crackdowns to weaken the country's three key gangs: Mara Salvatrucha, popularly known as MS-13, Barrio 18 Revolucionarios, commonly referred to as 18R, and Barrio Serenos, generally abbreviated as 18S. Bukele's anti-corruption drives were equally aggressive, as he instituted multiple investigations against government officials suspected of corrupt practices to cleanse the political landscape. One notable case was that of arrested high-profile individuals for embezzlement schemes, including former government officials who had gone scot-free for many years. Many Salvadorans rallied behind Bukele because of his anti-graft solid stance regarding corruption, which had been very endemic during past administrations. There was real action behind the rollout of that viral video of Bukele investigating his own cabinet members, and a full-scale effort many moons before it that illustrated that commitment. Yet even before this, Bukele had hit the headlines outside El Salvador with his violent crackdown on gang lords. One of the highly publicized cases is related to the leader of MS-13, Elmer Canales Rivera, alias Crook, Well-documented reports suggest that the Bukele administration conspires with human traffickers and gangsters in the pursuit of capturing Crook. They reached out to known human traffickers operating in El Salvador and Guatemala, Kevin Genoves and Jorge Vega Knight, respectively, who were suspected of having links with MS-13. When the search for the latter yielded nothing, the administration turned to Rafael Eduardo J., a senior leader of the Sereno faction of the 18th Street Gang, also a fugitive. Rafa arranged a meeting with some high police officials and offered to snag Crook in exchange for money and liberty for his sister who was jailed. It was announced that the cabinet was to be investigated, giving some continuity to the story of accountability and transparency initiated by Bukele. By publicly asking the Attorney General to investigate him against his ministers, Bukele is trying to say that he is serious about fighting corruption at the top levels of his government. No one, no matter what position, is above the law. The video capturing this announcement was a sober reflection of how unorthodox Bukele had been handling power. He proved his ability to go to extremities in keeping his pledges, no matter how politically indispensable those moves may seem. Reactions in the room, full of cabinet members, told something about that instant. What this step aimed to cripple was corruption and served as a loud message to the citizens and the international community alike. Bukele has undoubtedly remodeled the political landscape in El Salvador. Perhaps most importantly, from a policy perspective, there are severe changes, such as tackling crime and frontal attacks on corruption. All this has been controversial. Critics suggested that Bukele's authoritarian methods may be destructive to democratic institutions and pointed out mass arrests and a heavy-handed approach to dissent as indicative of an emerging autocracy. Bukele has maintained a high work approval rating based on improved public safety and the relentless chasing of corrupt officials. On the eve of the cabinet investigation, Bukele had done everything possible to clean his administration of corruption. One of his moves was appointing the Anti-Corruption Commission to implement strict measures for transparency in government transactions. These actions set the scene for the dramatic announcement of the cabinet investigation, reaffirming Bukele's commitment to accountability and integrity. Unpacking the presidential message. When Nayib Bukele announced an investigation into his own cabinet, he was making a very calculated point about power and transparency. He gave a strict lecture to the cabinet, saying none of them stood above scrutiny, and this change would have to come from the top. It was a bold step towards restoring people's trust and drawing a line between his administration and all previous self-serving corrupted administrations. The primary intention of Bukele was to show firm leadership and not tolerate corruption. He wanted to begin an investigation into his own cabinet to gain the people's trust and assure them that he was serious about his commitment to integrity, something quite imperative in these corruption and political instability cases in El Salvador. The very public nature of the announcement puts pressure on the Attorney General and other officials to conduct an investigation that shall not be partial and has to be done with a lot of detail. While many of Bukele's policies against gang violence changed the course dramatically, dropping the rate of crime, they came with an addition of highly unwanted consequences. The crackdown resulted in thousands of arrests. Many were later determined to be innocent. One highly publicized case occurred when a single mother who sold food on the street was taken from her home early in April without a search warrant or order of arrest, supposedly because she belonged to one of these gangs. When more than 500 cases attended, a specialized court placed a pre-trial detention order on her for belonging to an unlawful association. According to her family, there was no evidence regarding this charge. For this charge, she had been detained years earlier and brutally beaten. She was awarded financial reparation after reporting to the police for abuses of authority, which earned her a case of forced displacement with her children as a result of constant threats from the police. They had just returned home a few months before she was arrested in April. Her daughter said that the next day, local police came back to her house, put a gun to her head and threatened her, saying that she would be next. The same policemen who detained and threatened the young woman's mother were those who in May had arrested her. Amnesty International has found 2 other cases where, before being detained, the victims had denounced the abuse of power by the authorities. The arrest and criminal prosecution without due process of more than 35,000 people in less than 3 months would not have been possible if the judicial authorities had fulfilled their mandate. Instead, they are acting as accomplices to a public security policy ordered at the highest level that tramples on inalienable human rights, accepting as a necessary evil the widespread and unjust prosecution and imprisonment of people living in poverty. Another case is that of Marcelo, a young university student living with his family on a farm in a rural setting in El Salvador. Marcelo is not named to protect him from persecution. His story is just one of many revealing the dark side of Bukele's security policies. On March 27, 2022, because of a spike in crime that reached 67 murders in one weekend, the Legislative Assembly approved the exception regime. This regime has been extended 7 times, resulting in more than 50,000 detained gang members, 1,600 weapons seized, and 2,000 vehicles taken away from gang members and their relatives. Although the bulk of society agrees with the exception regime and believes that this regime has lessened crime considerably, instances like Marcelo's show the cruel reality of this regime. His brother was arrested for no reason during the invasion by the police charged with gang activity with absolutely no proof. With that incident, Marcelo and his family started to live in continuous fear of that stigma because of their living conditions and the area they lived in. The mega prison was meant to be the core of what President Bukele called his Plan Control Territorial, but became a symbol both for this government's hard hand as well as its abuse of issues related to human rights. Prisoners at the camp were reportedly living in harsh conditions and experiencing malnutrition, torture, and poor health care. The cases proved the dark side of Bukele's policies, arguably pushing the limits and raising questions about security versus human rights in this game between cats and mice. Critics argue that while the crackdown has helped make communities exercise their demons, it is also sowing fear and stoking suspicion of police in tire-fire fashion. Innocent citizens, primarily people living in gang-controlled communities, still have to live with the constant potential of being snatched off the street, from their car or more than likely, when they are having a quiet drink on their stoop. Reactions and impact. Although crimes have been significantly reduced by Bukele's ambitious anti-corruption and anti-gang initiatives, they have also ensnared innocent people in their nets on a scale that places the debate as to whether such broad-based measures are legitimate at all. The live, highly publicized announcement sent shockwaves across the nation. Most importantly, the strong will displayed by Bukele in clearing his administration of corruption gained attention. This sparked a heated debate among Salvadoran citizens, local media, and international observers. The announcement went viral on social media within minutes, gathering millions of views and sparking a nationwide debate. Salvadoran people were divided. Many praised Bukele for his guts in taking measures long overdue to clean up corruption in the government. Skepticism is abounded, however. Soon, opposition critics came forward and pointed out that it was not his best idea. Rather, Bukele might be doing it just to divert the public's attention from other pressing issues. Similarly, local media covering all the details about the story included leading names like El Faro and La Prensa Grafica. Editorials made some arguments about the possible consequences of taking steps by Bukele. Some of the journalists were cautiously optimistic. If this move by Bukele is genuine, it could prove to be a really important moment in the fight against corruption in El Salvador. Others said it raises deep questions about democratic norms. The risk of abuse of power is high. The ripple effects of the declaration made by Bukele did not stop at the frontiers of El Salvador, as it obtained immense attention from mainstream international media and political analysts. Major global news organizations, The Guardian and Reuters, seem to focus on the report that calls for an investigation into his cabinet as unprecedented from a president. There seems to be a general characterization of the move by Bukele as an attempt to personalize himself as the earthly embodiment of reforms toward openness and accountability. International political analysts reacted diversely. To some, Bukele deserves commendation for the hard line he has taken on corruption, arguing that most of the time, such measures do stand to break thugs of corruption that have captured far too many governments. For analysts of the American Affairs Journal, there may be a new regional benchmark set by Bukele's governance. He drew an analogy between his strategy and that of populist leaders who have pressed on with stringent anti-corruption measures, some of which have been successful and others not. Yet these actions were not universally welcomed. Human rights groups and a number of political analysts responded with concerns that the legislation was overreach or empirically bad for democratic institutions. Amnesty International and Human Rights Watch have continued to follow his case, raising concerns that the Bukele government could use this anti-corruption campaign against political opponents or critics as a power grab perceived by some which weaken the rule of law. These organizations supported ensuring the inquiries proceeded objectively and transparently without political interference. There is little doubt that hardline policies, such as those against gangs and lowering crime rates, extensively explain Bukele's popularity. Even if most, including Salvadorans themselves, remain at least skeptical of his increasingly authoritarian tendencies, most take his measure as the correct one to recover their communities and make order a possibility once again. That is evident enough from the re-election figures of 85%, trapped only recently, reflecting widespread public approval of the administration's stance. Comparisons to other global leaders have already begun to surface, with Bukele being likened most soundly to Rodrigo Duterte of the Philippines. Duterte's war on drugs, condemned by many for human rights abuses, had a certain degree of popularity among Filipinos, who believed it made their communities more secure. Equally, Bukele's drive against corruption has been winning wide support from Salvadorans who are tired of corruption and crime, even as some have expressed worries over abuses. In the days following Bukele's announcement, the country was placed under very high expectations and scrutiny. The public and media were on their toes to establish how those premises previously given by Bukele would result in actual changes or deeds relevant to them. As the investigation evolved, it became a defining moment for Bukele's presidency, redeemable for the future of El Salvador's political landscape. Indeed, the international community had its eyes fixed on this bold initiative, knowing that the results would go way beyond affecting El Salvador alone, and from that, a great deal could be portended for the broader region. As the investigation unfolded, Salvadoran public opinion was alive and vocal, with everyone voicing and holding their collective breath as to what it would bring out of these most daring moves. Taking the risk to expose possible misbehavior within his cabinet could have been a too costly political risk for Bukele. Yet this kind of courage could redefine his legacy and set the course of bending the future toward better governance in El Salvador. The fact that he was willing to investigate his own cabinet proves he would stand up against corruption, regardless of the cost, politically speaking. It does not matter whether they were sincerely committed or strategically calculated. It did not go unseen. El Salvador, before the eyes of the world, stood at the crossroads to either take a historic turn with transparency and accountability in the new age, or grapple with the challenges and controversies that go with mere ambitious initiatives. The move thus had daring effects on the political career of Bukele and government operations, bringing into view an exciting saga of power, loyalty, and justice. An investigation quickly focused on key figures within the administration of President Nayib Bukele. This crusade against corruption had a double-edged sword effect on Bukele's political career. On the one hand, it sealed his reputation in the ranks of supporters as a determined reformer committed to purifying corruption from the very top level of government. This brand new support came in handy, particularly in light of his very controversial measures to confront gang violence, which had already polarized public opinion. For many Salvadorians, the decision by Bukele to hold his own cabinet accountable made for a refreshing rupture with the norm. The move had crashed. It could be an excellent opportunity to backfire spectacularly. Bukele's targeting prominent cabinet members and creating inner divisions within his party, Nuevas Ideas, may alienate cabinet members of great influence. The latter could affect the administration's ability to administer and give it less stability, marring policy execution. Another complication in the political scenario was the reaction from the international community against Bukele's move. Even though others have applauded this act of transparency and boldness, institutions on human rights like Amnesty International and Human Rights Watch have questioned possible power abuse. In other words, Bukele may use such an anti-corruption campaign as the gateway to entrench himself in power and target political opponents, with justice possibly clothed to misrepresent him, debilitating El Salvador's diplomatic relations and prospects for foreign aid within the international community. In the long run, the administration will be characterized by its success or failure in this anti-corruption investigation. A genuinely fair and rigorous process might drastically minimize corruption, hence setting a new accountability criterion for El Salvador. Institutional confidence among citizens would increase, making the administration more legitimate and efficient. If the investigation fizzled out or was perceived as politically motivated, it could have disastrous results. The public would become so disillusioned with the administration of Bukele that there would be even greater cynicism and disengagement from the political process. This could weaken El Salvador's democratic institutions in the long term and undermine efforts to fight corruption. Further, the result of the investigation would have far-reaching implications for Bukele's potential to transform all other key policies. A government that has the image of being clean and accountable would attract more national and international goodwill toward its agendas, economic development through improved public security. On the contrary, if doubts were cast over corruption, that would undermine the credibility of the administration and, as a consequence, weaken its governing capacity. Perhaps the boldest gamble of Bukele's risk-taking presidency is to initiate an investigation into corruption in his very cabinet. Success would define a new governance model and, by far, go beyond any former leader who has sparked El Salvador onto the international stage. Potential pitfalls abounded: political fallout, internal bloodletting, and international scrutiny. The ability of Bukele to hold on to the public trust in the rule of law and systemic reforms would be a yardstick for success in the investigation. It was Bukele's administration that balanced an unprecedented new era of accountability with the world for an audience against the political risks of overreach. Further, the result of the investigation would have far-reaching implications for Bukele's potential to transform all other key policies. A government that has the image of being clean and accountable would attract more national and international goodwill toward its agendas, economic development through improved public security. On the contrary, if doubts were cast over corruption, that would undermine the credibility of the administration and, as a consequence, weaken its governing capacity. Perhaps the boldest gamble of Bukele's risk-taking presidency is to initiate an investigation into corruption in his very cabinet. Success would define a new governance model and, by far, go beyond any former leader who has sparked El Salvador onto the international stage. Potential pitfalls abounded: political fallout, internal bloodletting, and international scrutiny. The ability of Bukele to hold on to the public trust in the rule of law and systemic reforms would be a yardstick for success in the investigation. Bukele's administration balanced an unprecedented new era of accountability with the world for an audience against the political risks of overreach. It could consecrate Bukele as a pioneering reformer or expose all the complexities and challenges of wielding power in a corruption-ridden landscape. These events were about to be the defining chapter in the history of El Salvador, with both the political career of Bukele and the way that the country would be governed moving into high balance. The shockwaves of President Nayib Bukele's corruption investigation did not stay inside the administration, but went beyond to change El Salvador politically and diplomatically. The potential effects on the country would be huge, from the transformation of people's perception to political participation, and even El Salvador's standing on the world stage. His anti-corruption drive also viewed foreign relations with El Salvador. It was a development that the international community had its eyes on, as many international observers at that time viewed it as the litmus test of the Bukele government toward reforms and transparency. On the bright side, it received wide accolades among world leaders and organizations. For countries keen on good governance and anti-corruption, Bukele's step was quite in the right direction. Of course, this can translate into increased diplomatic support and therefore more favorable trade and aid agreement terms. For example, institutions like the IMF and the World Bank, which highly value transparency and responsibility, might have a changed view regarding financial support and development programs toward El Salvador. The human rights organizations and several foreign governments also slammed the campaign. Reports by Amnesty International, Human Rights Watch, and others report concerns related to the possibility of abuses and targeting of political opponents. These critiques could strain El Salvador's relations with key allies, particularly those for whom human rights and democratic norms are important to foreign policy. The United States, one major player and major partner to El Salvador, put forward a very complex response. While being open to efforts against corruption, the U.S. government also had qualms about the general governance style of Bukele, who at times undermined democratic institutions. It was quite a fine line to walk between support for anti-corruption measures and concerns over authoritarian tendencies. According to U.S. policymakers, stability and good governance in El Salvador had huge implications for regional security and migration. The anti-corruption inquiry has the potential to transform El Salvador's political culture over the long term. In case it succeeds, it will probably mean laying a very strong precedent for subsequent administrations, having deeply instilled the ethos of anti-corruption measures in the way of governing. This could create a more open, accountable, and lean government that will spur economic growth and deliver better public services. It could be an investment in educational campaigns and civic programs that help to promote ethical behavior and civic responsibility among youthful Salvadorans. The attitude change could reflect the gradual wearing down of willingness to accept reality and corrupt practices that institutionalize a new style of civic culture, one that demands integrity from its leaders. Conversely, if the investigation failed or was seen seen as one-sided, it would further ingrain cynicism and apathy, worsening all that it set out to improve. A botched anti-corruption drive may inhibit future drives, since efforts meant to create political will and garner public support for such drives would be harder to pool together. Unless averted, a spiral of corruption and disillusionment would continue destabilizing this country. Thanks for watching this video.
Check out the on-screen cards now for more stories.